think I got a story you might be interested in, and it's from when I was in the Philippines a few years back around Easter. So, being a really Christian country, Filipinos take Easter very, very seriously. There are tons of celebrations everywhere, feasts and special markets and stuff. It's a pretty amazing experience to be there during that time of year. I ended up eating some incredible food and seeing some incredible things too. But then one of the things I saw was literally one of the single most terrifying things I've ever seen. Legitimately like something out of a horror movie. No disrespect intended to the Philippines, as I love that country and I can't wait to go back sometime, but some get really crazy during Easter. I was just walking around enjoying all the amazing food on offer, especially the pork skewers, dampa shrimp, and this kind of cake thing called mango float. Picture it like I'm walking down the main drag, and down each of the little streets to my left, there's little parties going on. Shirtless guys drinking in the streets, generally a good time being had by all. Then the next thing I know, I look down one of the streets and I literally see Jesus. Or rather, not the actual Jesus, Son of God from 2,000 years ago. I see a Filipino guy dressed as Jesus. Not just that, though. He has a red robe on, the crown of thorns, and is carrying this huge-looking cross, like the whole Passion of the Christ getup. He wasn't the only one dressed up, though. A bunch of guys are dressed up as Roman soldiers, and they're playing the part too, shouting at the crowd if they get too close, whipping them with these sort of cat-o'-nine-tails style flails. It was pretty amazing to watch, but some Pinoy, that means Filipino dude, must have noticed the look on my face, kind of how amazed I was, and comes over like, "First time?" I told him, yeah, that we don't really have anything like that where I'm from, and he just smiles and tells me to walk a few streets over if I want to see something really mind-blowing. I couldn't really have imagined anything crazier than that at the time, but boy was I wrong to think it couldn't get any crazier. But as I walked down in the direction he pointed, and looked left down the street, the first thing I notice is tons and tons of what appeared to be blood. There had to be like 15 to 20 guys, all walking around in a loop, and they're like whipping themselves with whips with dried palm fronds on the end. They're like the leaves on a palm tree, and when they're dried out like that, I imagine they really hurt. But the fronds weren't what was causing all the blood to pour out of their backs. That much was clear, because every so often one or two of the guys would drop out of line and head over to this guy who looked like he was holding something small in his hand. They turned their backs to him, and he just started jabbing them with what I later found out was a freaking razor blade. Then once they were maybe 24 heavily bleeding wounds on their back, they'd rush back into line and carry on whipping themselves. I think I suddenly understood what the palm frond whips were for, too, once I saw how they flicked blood all over the place. They weren't to hurt so much as, like, spread the blood all over the street. It was hitting the spectators, too. I saw this one kid, had to be, like, younger than 10, and his beige-colored t-shirt was covered in these little red flecks of the guy's blood. I asked one of the bystanders what in God's name was going on, and they told me in broken English that it was like they were punishing themselves for their sins or something. I grew up in an Irish neighborhood, lots of Catholics, as you can imagine, and all they did to pay for their sins was go to confession and say a bunch of Hail Marys. You didn't catch anyone asking the neighbors to cut them before whipping themselves, that's for sure. That whole scene was a little too much for me. Like, I wouldn't say I was particularly squeamish or anything, but having a stomach full of food meant that I was dangerously close to puking it all up again, seeing all that blood splattering around the street. I walked off, intent on finding the guy cosplaying as Jesus again, as that was considerably more interesting without being in the least bit nauseating. People were pretty welcoming too, saying stuff like, "Hey Joe," to me all the time, which is like a thing Pinoys say to Americans or white people in general, just like a funny way to say hello. I made a few videos on my phone, and people seemed genuinely happy that a foreigner was so invested in their little procession. It's about then that I asked someone where Jesus and his Roman boys were headed, and someone just replied, "Jesus is going to be crucified." I mean, of course he was. That's how all the Passion plays end, so that wasn't exactly a massive surprise to me. I just never figured that the person meant that the cosplay Jesus was about to get literally crucified. If I'd have known that, I'd have never have followed, but in my ignorance, I just kept on going. I remember how we left the open streets until we came across this hill, and as we started walking up it, I remember thinking about how legit the whole thing was. They really were reenacting the whole crucifixion thing, taking Jesus out of the town to crucify him on a hill. They even had 2 other guys waiting up there next to their own crosses, but since they weren't actually mounted to them or whatever, I still thought the whole thing was just play acting. But then, as we got to the top of the hill, and Jesus got laid down on his cross with his arms extended, I watched as one of the Roman soldier guys produced some big nails from a leather pouch that he was carrying. What happened next was like in slow motion, as the whole time I'm thinking, no, don't do it, don't do it. But he did. The guy lined up the nail with Jesus' palm, then after producing a hammer from somewhere, he started carefully nailing Jesus' hand to the cross. As soon as the first hammer blow came down and blood burst up from cosplay Jesus' hand, I was forced to not just look away, but walk away from the whole thing too. People were just in raptures though, some squirming and grimacing, but others smiling like it was the best thing they'd ever seen. I was just numb for the rest of the afternoon, like I'd never seen anything like that in my whole life up until that point. It was nuts. I mean, I understand why they do it, how that kind of devotion is revered. I mean, it was definitely kind of impressive that the guy would put himself through that kind of punishment just for a cause or whatever. I never do it myself. I don't think I'd ever be able to carry the cross up the hill, let alone actually lie still while someone put a freaking nail through my hand. But anyone who's got that kind of determination in them, a lot of respect for them, man. Gotta be honest. I ended up asking another Filipino guy back at my hotel what the deal was with the whole crucifixion thing, and he broke it down for me. The guy getting crucified does it about every year, and I don't know how true that is, but apparently he's basically just got scar tissue all through the palm of his hand by that point, and as long as the Roman dudes work the nail through the scar tissue, it barely hurts him anymore. Like I said, I don't know how true that is. Like, surely it's still got to be agony no matter how many times it's happened. But then, if that's the case, that guy is crazy dedicated to his religion. And like I said, even if it is in a real weird way, you kinda gotta respect something as wild as that. I want to share a story from my childhood with you, one that ended in years of therapy for me. It's not scary in the traditional sense, I don't think, because I don't suppose I was in any real danger, but I'll tell it to you anyway, and you can be the judge of it if you read it out in one of your videos. It was Easter of 1995, and I had just turned 6 years old a month before, so I was still really young and naive to all the darker things in the world. And on Easter Sunday, I remember my mom taking me to an Easter egg hunt that was being held at a local church. I was so excited to get to play with the other kids outside of school. Like, it seemed like such a novelty to see everyone in their own clothes, and their Sunday best at that. That, and knowing that we'd all be literally hunting for chocolate treats, was something I was so bloody excited for, and I remember that really vividly. But that's not the only thing from that day that I remember vividly, and the other thing was way, way worse than the prospect of cavities from overeating chocolate. I remember finding a couple of eggs to start with, and I ran over to my mom, who was standing with the other parents so she could keep them safe from me. But then as the morning went on and more of the kids started finding their own eggs, it got harder and harder to find any. I remember wanting to give up, as did most of the other kids, as it was just too difficult to find any more eggs, so we basically assumed that they were all gone. But then, the priest announced that he'd counted up all the eggs that had been found, and that there were definitely still 1 or 2 left out there on the grounds of the church. Myself and the other kids went into a frenzy at hearing that, knowing that we'd somehow managed to miss a couple of the eggs. I remember running off further than the other kids and completely ignoring my mom when she told me not to run off too far. A few moments later, I found myself wandering through some trees, my eyes scanning the undergrowth, looking for the telltale shimmer of the shiny wrapping paper that each egg was contained in. Moments later, I saw someone standing just behind a small bush, standing perfectly still with their back to me. I could only really see the top half of them, but I remember recognizing that it was a girl from the long hair that she had that was tied back in like this light purple bauble. "Are you looking for eggs too?" I remember asking, but the girl didn't move. I then took a few more steps towards her. Around the bush she was half concealed behind, and I suddenly noticed that her feet were dangling a few inches off the ground. I also suddenly noticed that her tie, what looked like a school tie anyway, wasn't hanging down. It was like up in the air, and was tied around a tree branch maybe a few feet above her head. Being so young and naive, I didn't put two and two together. I just thought it was some kind of game or something. I had no idea what I was actually looking at. It sounds quite silly thinking back on it, but I actually thought she was asleep or something, but then I walked around to her front and saw her face. It was almost the same color as her bauble, this purpley color all over her cheeks and forehead, only unlike the nice pretty shade that her bauble was, this kind of purple looked all wrong to be on someone's face like that. That's when I remember running back to my mom in tears, and when everyone asked me what was wrong, all I could do was wail and point back towards where I had just run from. I remember some of the other adults running off into the trees, maybe thinking some perv was back there or something, but moments later, they came running back out again, shouting all different things and presumably calling 999. I didn't see anything else after that. All the kids got whisked away to prevent them from seeing anything else that might distress them. I do remember that about a week later, a lot of the other adults went to a funeral. Not that I knew it at the time, I just went to stay with my grandparents over in Peterborough for a night. It was only many years later that I actually found out what was going on. The girl had been living in our village with her parents, but had been going through a period of depression for quite some time. I don't know exactly what it was, but there was an incident at her school that meant she didn't want to go anymore. But her parents weren't in a position to just pack up and move somewhere else, so they basically just let her take some time off, then made her go back to the same school she was having issues in. She was supposed to go in on the Friday before I found her, just for a half day to get her used to things before the Easter holidays commenced. I think it was just supposed to be a nice and casual thing for her, something to reintroduce her to school without it being too intense or heavy or whatever. But apparently, she'd literally rather die than go back to that school, and instead, she went to the church, as close to the graveyard as she could get without literally being there, and did what you can possibly imagine to herself from a tree by her own school tie. It's all an incredibly sad and tragic story, and like I said, I ended up going through therapy for a few years because it really damaged my psyche as a kid. Because I didn't understand what I'd seen, I kept asking my mom and dad about it, and obviously that meant that they had to basically explain what death was to me. All of my grandparents were still alive at that stage, and none of my pets had gone to heaven yet, as my parents put it, so the whole concept was entirely new to me. Needless to say, the whole thing messed me up massively, and all my parents could think to explain to me was that the girl had had an accident, as they couldn't bring themselves to explain what it was of taking your own life to a 6-year-old girl. Can't even blame them really though, can you? The whole thing was bad enough without having to explain something like that. Anyway, it took me a while, but I did manage to get over it after a few years. I suppose kids can be quite resilient like that, and I know for a fact that all the therapy sessions have helped tremendously. I still remember how nice the woman was, how calm her voice made me, and how she didn't really treat me like a baby, even though she was still super kind and gentle in her mannerisms. But yeah, that's my story, and although I definitely still think about that poor girl from time to time, I'm not nearly as traumatized as I used to be over it. I just wish I knew what the thing was that made her so afraid to go to school. Like, I know it could have been a bullying thing, but sometimes I wonder if it wasn't something much darker and eviler. Like maybe one of her teachers was doing something that she couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. I really, really hope that that wasn't the case. But even so, it doesn't matter, does it? Because she still chose the most horrible solution imaginable to whatever problem she had. And with that, the truth of whatever horrible thing had happened to her died along with her. Born on January 28th of 1971, Dana Ewell was the youngest son of Dale and Glee Ewell. Dale was a United States Air Force veteran, and upon his discharge, he started a company named Western Piper Sales, which specialized in the sale of small aircraft. Being a highly knowledgeable aviation expert with a set of highly specialized skills, Dale's company became very popular very quickly, and by the time Dana was a young adult, his father's company was worth millions upon millions of dollars. Glee, on the other hand, after working as a Spanish translator for the CIA during the 1950s, had devoted much of her life to philanthropy and public service. She had also held a seat on the State Bar of California, an organization which evaluates the credentials of prospective judges. Naturally, she was very well compensated for her work, and this further swelled the Ewell family coffers. The Ewells accumulated even more wealth off the back of investments in both the stock market and local farmland. Yet despite being extremely well off, the Ewells lived a modest lifestyle and tended to avoid flaunting their wealth. By 1992, it's believed the Ewells were worth between $7 to $8 million, which is the equivalent to around $14 million today. This meant that the Ewells were able to live very comfortably. Yet despite their financial stability, all was not well within the family. During Dana Ewell's time in college, he began to paint a rather deceptive picture of his own personal finances. Around his junior year, Dana began lying to people that his family's financial success was solely due to his extensive entrepreneurial skills. He told his peers that, despite being so young, he'd set up several prosperous companies that made him a very wealthy man. His lies were even swallowed wholesale by a local newspaper in Santa Clara, who printed a story on Dana in 1990 which described him as a self-made millionaire. However, Dana didn't realize that his parents were closely monitoring his educational progress from afar, and when they stumbled across some of his lies printed in the Santa Clara University's yearbook, they were nothing short of furious. They confronted their arrogant younger child almost immediately, professing their disappointment in his pompous deception. They believed they'd raised him better than that, and decided he needed to be taught a lesson for humanity. They told Dana that they were going to end almost all of their financial support for him, and told him that if he wanted to wax lyrical in his entrepreneurial skills, he'd have to walk the walk, and not just talk the talk. Upon hearing the news, Dale was beyond livid. He was humiliated that his parents had exposed his lies and was incensed that they'd ended his ability to pretend he was some playboy millionaire. Dale didn't talk to his parents for quite a while after that. Due to his dire financial situation, he was soon forced to crawl back to them on bended knee, begging them to let him live in their Fresno home he'd grown up in until he had the means to properly support himself. Dale and Glee were still angry with him, but he was still their son, and they wanted nothing more than to help him get ahead in life. So, they accepted, and in late 1991, they allowed Dana to move back in their home, on the condition that he works towards finding a job and getting his own place. As the months went by, Dana seemed to be doing just that. He not only found himself a girlfriend, but also a job as an investment banking intern. If he managed to prove himself worthy, he'd have been on a six-figure salary from the jump, more than enough to start looking for high-end apartments, allowing him to step back into the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. Slowly but surely, Dana and his parents began to repair the relationship, and soon everything was back to normal, and they seemed to have forgotten his past indiscretions. Around Easter weekend of 1992, the Yules were looking forward to a peaceful, wholesome holiday weekend in the company of their 24-year-old daughter, Tiffany Ann. Dana, on the other hand, had arranged to head off on some kind of staycation with his current girlfriend, and on the day of his departure, he wished his loving family well, then set off to enjoy a romantic, private week of intimacy. Yet even though Dana wished for privacy with his girlfriend, he still made an effort to keep in touch with his parents. Yet according to him, 2 days after Easter Sunday, he found that his calls were no longer being answered. Dana then called some friends in Sunnyside, California, and was said to be incredibly anxious that he couldn't reach his parents. He then talked his friends into stopping by over the Yules family home in order to perform a kind of welfare check, and when they drove over to make sure Dana's parents were okay, what they discovered was beyond horrifying. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany and Yule were all lying dead in various rooms of the house, each with multiple gunshot wounds, and within hours of the friends checking in at the home, Fresno County homicide detectives were on the scene. Over the next 4 days, detectives John Souza and Chris Curtis combed through the crime scene in search of clues. It quickly became obvious that whoever had slaughtered the family had secreted themselves inside the house and had ambushed the unwitting Yule family after returning home from somewhere. Glenn and Tiffany had been shot once, execution style, suggesting they had been completely unaware of their impending deaths. Glee, on the other hand, had been shot 4 times, which made it clear that she had discovered the killer before attempting to flee, forcing them to shoot her multiple times in order to prevent her escape. There was a complete lack of shell casings on the scene, which meant the shooter had taken the time to retrieve them once the job was done, and out of all the bullets he'd fired during the attack, only one seemed to have missed its target. Even more chilling was the fact that the 9mm bullets used had actually been purchased by Dale Yule himself, meaning the killer had taken the time to intimately research the Yule family, even down to what caliber of ammunition was in the house. Using their own ammunition meant that nothing could be traced back to the killer, meaning a very important avenue in investigation had been completely closed off to the investigating detectives. The killer had also used some kind of silencer on the firearm used to murder the Yules, as not only did none of their neighbors hear any gunshots over Easter weekend, but the lack of bullet penetration meant something had slowed the velocity in flight. The detectives also noticed that the home appeared to have been ransacked, possibly in the search of valuables. But Detective Souza, who had extensive experience in investigating burglaries, observed that very little of value had been taken. He suggested that the ransacking had simply been staged, a way of throwing investigators off the scent of what had actually occurred. In Detective Souza's eyes, all clues pointed in one direction, that a highly professional contract killer had been hired to eliminate the Yule family. The only question was, who would have the motivation or harbor enough of a grudge to hire such a person? Detective Souza and Curtis then set about analyzing each of the victims' professional and social lives in order to identify possible perpetrators. And that's how they discovered that Dale Yule wasn't exactly as squeaky clean as he liked to portray himself. In the late 1970s, Dale had gotten involved with a man named Frank Lambie, a California-based drug smuggler who had been sentenced to prison over his illicit activities. Rumor had it that when Frank had been locked up, Dale had taken over smuggling operations, and when Frank was released, Dale had refused to step aside, essentially muscling his former partner out of tens of millions of dollars a year. This would most definitely provide a motive for murder, and with Frank already having rubbed shoulders with criminals while in jail, there was no doubt that he had the contacts to get the job done. Yet that wasn't the only dodgy dealing that Dale Yule had been involved in, as he'd also ended up entangled in a shady real estate development deal with his own brother. When Dale backed out and the deal went sour, his brother was blamed for losing millions of dollars of investment money, and while it seemed over the top for there to be a blood feud among family members, stranger things have certainly happened. When law enforcement sought to determine if the family had any potential enemies, one of the first people they got in contact with was obviously Dana Yule. Dana had a solid alibi, as He had obviously been in San Francisco with his girlfriend, but for the homicide detectives, the fact that he just so happened to be absent on the weekend of the murder was far too suspicious for them to ignore. Detectives had also been in touch with Dana's uncle, who told them that Dana seemed far more interested in what his inheritance was than the fact that he just lost his entire family. They also added that when Dana learned the majority of his inheritance was in a trust fund that he wouldn't have access until his 30s, he became visibly shaken and angry. It was also noted that one of Dana's old college buddies, a man by the name of Joel Radovich, had suddenly dropped out of school in the aftermath of the murders before going on something of a spending spree. Police decided to observe Joel's movements and lifestyle from a distance, and in the process, they discovered something extremely pertinent to their investigation. Joel was obsessed with the use and maintenance of firearms, and was often heard to brag about his accuracy with them. Not only that, but Joel claimed to have several close acquaintances that he was capable of creating homemade silencers using nothing but pieces of metal pipe. Dana and Joel continued to attract suspicion when they both moved in the Yule's Fresno home just weeks after the murders. Any other person might be repulsed by the idea of laying their heads where their own family had been slain, yet Dana didn't seem to mind in the least bit. They also seemed to adopt something of a party lifestyle, buying brand new pagers and other electrical equipment, as well as drinking an unusual amount of champagne for people who ought to be grieving a loss. Joel even bought himself a set of flying lessons, which definitely set him back a sizable amount of money. Police had already confirmed that Joel was unemployed, and it was clear that Dana was funding his lifestyle. But why exactly would he be doing that? It could have been out of the kindness of his heart, but homicide detectives believed there was another, far more sinister reason for it, and they were determined to unearth what it was. All throughout May of 1993, the cops kept Dana and Joel under close surveillance, and at one point, a detective followed Patrick to a payphone while wearing a specialized piece of recording equipment. It was then the detective managed to catch Joel saying something very suspicious into the payphone, most probably to Dana. He was quoted as saying, "Look, man, they don't have any evidence, okay? What they're probably going to do is try and catch you in a lie, so just keep your mouth shut and we'll both be fine." With that, the detectives knew for certain who they should focus their investigation on, convinced that if they dug deep enough, that Joel would somehow be intrinsically connected to the murders. This connection was finally identified when law enforcement began to focus on identifying the murder weapon. After a thorough analysis of the bullets recovered from the dead bodies of the Yule family, it was determined that they were fired by a high-end 9mm specialty rifle manufactured by Feather Industries in Trinidad, Colorado. Company records showed one such rifle had been purchased by Ernest Jack Ponce, a friend of Joel's family, just weeks before the Yules were shot with it. Jack Ponce admitted buying the rifle for Joel, but was horrified when he discovered it was used in the murders. Jack knew that Joel was a huge firearm enthusiast, but believed he only wanted the rifle for target and competitive shooting. He told police that despite unwittingly disposing of evidence, he had no idea that Joel was planning on killing anyone, and offered his full and unfettered cooperation in testifying against the two men. With a star witness in the bag, the police swooped in, arresting both Dana Yule and Joel Radovich in early 1995. Throughout the course of their 8-month trial, they were up against two of Fresno County's top district attorneys, who each argued that Dana Yule was a despicable human being, motivated only by greed, who was willing to swap his own family's lives to indulge in a selfish, hedonistic lifestyle. Not only that, but he actually convinced someone equally psychopathic to do the killing for him. Dana's attorney opted to shift the blame onto Joel, making it seem like he intimidated his old college buddy into splitting his inheritance with him. Joel's attorney, on the other hand, believed the evidence was so overwhelming that a guilty verdict was probable, and thus his main goal should be avoiding the death penalty. After 11 days of deliberation, the jury found both Dana and Joel to be guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Not only that, but they were subject to considerably stricter sentences based on the fact that the murders were purely for financial gain. Yet somehow, both managed to avoid the death penalty. July 20th of 1998 saw each of the men handed life sentences without the possibility of parole, and despite several appeals being lodged on their behalf, all have been denied. It's worth noting that for the majority of his sentence, Dana Ewell had been detained in the protective housing unit of the California State Prison. This is due to the particularly greedy and immoral nature of his crime, and the fact that he had his own family murdered purely for monetary gain when he was already in an extremely privileged position in life. This has naturally made him extremely unpopular with other prisoners, and he was regularly targeted for reprisal by those that are disgusted by his cruel and callous nature. Consider how abhorrent a person has to be singled out by other criminals as being worthy of punishment. But then again, a person who had their own parents killed on Easter, the very people who brought them into the world, loved them, and nurtured them, it's hard to imagine a punishment for them that could be described as too harsh. Back in 1943, on the Saturday before Easter Sunday, 55-year-old Patrick Brady arrived back home from his 8-hour shift at the Inland Steel Company in Lansing, Illinois. He lived on 181st Street with his 14-year-old foster daughter, Gloria Sullivan, who at the time was in the Calvin Coolidge School's 8th grade. Patrick had a tough job, and he worked hard to keep his foster daughter happy. But thanks to his back-breaking, tireless endeavors, he had carved out a relatively happy existence taking care of young Gloria. They were poor, they were struggling, but they were content. Yet as soon as Patrick arrived home that day, he knew something was horribly, horribly wrong. The first thing he noticed was a loud, blaring sound coming from inside his home, and when he walked inside, he realized the cause was the radio that they kept in the house's living room. He walked into the room, shut off the radio, then immediately called out to Gloria, but there was no answer. This immediately struck him as unusual. Gloria should have been home from school hours ago, and Patrick operated a strict policy whereby she had to tell him if she was leaving the house. He then realized that she may have walked down to one of the local stores to pick up some groceries for herself. Patrick couldn't always be there to cook due to his long working hours, and he often left Gloria a few dollars so that she could feed herself. If that was the case, she would have left a note on the kitchen table for him. Yet when he walked into the kitchen, he was greeted by a sight that scarred him for the rest of his days. Gloria was lying on the kitchen floor, a huge pool of her blood collecting on the linoleum beneath her. She was fully clothed, with curlers in her hair, and she was dead, with the manner of her death being nothing short of a living nightmare. Gloria Sullivan had been stabbed exactly 20 times, with 14 deep wounds to her back, 5 to her chest, with the worst being a stab wound to the base of her throat. There was also a series of defensive wounds on Gloria's arms and hands, meaning that she had tried to fend off her attacker during what had been a brutal and sustained attack involving 2 separate murder weapons. One was a smaller paring knife that was found broken off the handle, with the blade being discovered wedged in a crack in the kitchen's hardwood floor. The other, a long-bladed butcher's knife, was found lying nearby, drenched in Gloria's blood. Upon inspection, Patrick confirmed that both knives had been taken from the home's kitchen. They were knives he paid for out of his own hard-earned salary, and they had been used to end his own foster daughter's life. There were no signs of robbery, and other than the horrific scene in the kitchen, the remainder of the home was in near immaculate order. There were no signs of forced entry and no signs of pursuit through the home. It seemed as if the Gloria had been subjected to a very effective and very terrifying ambush by someone who had been watching her for quite some time. When it came to evidence the police could use in their investigation, there turned out to be quite a lot for them to go on. Aside from the obvious murder weapons, law enforcement located a bloody palm print next to the bathroom wash basin, and they also noticed something curious about Gloria's hairbrush. Although the girl herself was a brunette, the cops found a series of long blonde hairs tangled up in the bristles. They also found a series of blood-stained towels in the bathroom, obviously from where the killer had cleaned themselves off before escaping the house. After that, it was just a case of identifying possible suspects, yet unfortunately, that proved far easier said than done. Investigators also learned that around the time of her 4th birthday, Gloria and her sister had been placed in the care of the state. Their biological father, Clarence Sullivan, had suddenly abandoned his young family one day, which had left the girl's mother, Viola, to care for the children on her own. Tragically, Viola found herself financially and emotionally incapable of caring for the children, and they were eventually placed in the state's care. Then, just a few weeks after they were taken, Viola passed away in what can only be described as mysterious circumstances. Patrick Brady and his wife took Gloria into their care in 1935, but were unable to legally adopt her because they were unable to locate her sister Clarence, which, at the time, was a precondition for adopting children of that age. Yet that didn't stop the Bradys from caring for Gloria as if she was their biological daughter. And, as we previously touched on, the family managed to carve out something of a peaceful existence for themselves despite all the tragedies of the past. Yet as the years went by, tragedy would once again visit the family as, in 1941, Patrick's wife would pass away after a painful and protracted battle with cancer. Following her death, Gloria was forced to step up and take on the role of homemaker, which arguably took away what little of her childhood she had left. Despite that, she was said to have excelled at school and became a pillar of the community by helping out with the child-rearing duties of neighboring families. In light of that, news of her brutal murder rocked the local community, and the furious outcry prompted law enforcement to conduct a rapid and thorough investigation. The town of Lansing spared no expense, essentially giving the police department a blank check to fund their investigation. They wanted justice, but whether or not they would see any remained to be seen. Homicide detectives began by building up a detailed picture of the hours which preceded Gloria's murder. After Patrick had departed for work at around 8 a.m., Gloria had called a school friend to ask if she wanted to go shopping for new Easter outfits in nearby Hammond, Indiana. This school friend traveled over to the Brady's place just in time to see a local delivery man dropping off some laundry, and naturally, this man quickly became a suspect in Gloria's murder. However, when 37-year-old Howard Dozier was questioned in relation to her murder, police were soon forced to clear him of all suspicion. Howard had stuck to a strict delivery route that day and had a number of alibis that made it impossible for him to have been in the area at the time of the slaying. A magazine salesman was also questioned by police after the Brady's neighbors informed them that they had spotted him in the area at the time Gloria was murdered. Yet he too was released after establishing a solid alibi. A bunch of Gloria's school friends were also questioned in connection with her death, but only one could provide any helpful clues as to the identity of her killer. Gloria's friend claimed she had checked over at the house at around 10:20, but when she attempted to enter the home, she found the screen door was locked. She knocked almost continually for around 5 to 10 minutes, but no one came to the door. When asked, the friend said that she hadn't heard the sound of the radio blaring, but the little detail about the locked screen door was nothing short of chilling to the investigators. When Patrick had returned home, it had been unlocked, meaning there was a high probability that at the same time Gloria's friend had stopped over, Gloria was in the process of being murdered just feet away from her. As the list of potential suspects grew shorter and shorter, police made a general appeal to the public for any and all assistance they might be able to offer. That's when one credible witness came forward, claiming to have seen 50-year-old Clarence Sullivan, Gloria's estranged biological father, riding on a local bus right around the time of the murder. The thought of a biological father murdering his own daughter was almost too horrifying to bear, but he still needed to be eliminated as a potential suspect. Yet this proved difficult, as law enforcement efforts to track him down were fruitless. Even Gloria's sister, who by then was a 20-year-old telephone operator in Chicago, had no idea where her father was and claimed they hadn't spoken since he'd walked out on the family back in the 30s. Clarence, who investigators once named as their prime suspect, was never ever tracked down, and eventually he was declared legally dead in absentia. Police then recovered Gloria's diary from her bedroom and, during an analysis of the entries, found that someone had apparently tried to flirt with Gloria in the previous few days, and that the incident had made the young girl feel deeply uncomfortable. Yet frustratingly, Gloria had neglected to include a name for the man, nor had she added any kind of written description. This left law enforcement in the painful position of knowing exactly who their murderer might have been, while being completely unable to identify them. Sadly, even though a heavily funded police department had once promised swift justice for Gloria's murder, the case eventually went cold. Patrick Brady, having lost the one remaining member of his family, fell into a deep depression, and over the years that followed, he regularly visited the local police department to check if there was any progress in the investigation. 4 years after Gloria's murder, when Patrick dropped dead from a catastrophic heart attack, those who knew him blamed the stress of his foster daughter's murder for his death. Patrick died the same day Gloria did, and they said it was just a matter of time before it caught up with him. Gloria was laid to rest on April 7th at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Lansing. A crowd of almost 100 of her fellow students, neighbors, and family members all attended the funeral, and apart from the obvious inscriptions, Patrick wished just one word to be chiseled into the stone: daughter. Patrick could never have known that just 4 years later he would be laid to rest in the plot next to it, but it seems only fitting that he should spend the rest of eternity next to the young woman that he had once cared for so deeply. 80 years later, Gloria's murder is no closer to being solved than it was a month after her life was snuffed out by the cruel and callous actions of a pure predator. And it's more than likely that her killing will remain a terrifying and confounding mystery until the end of time itself. On April Fool's Day of 1988, just 2 days before Easter Sunday, the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, was the site of one of the most frightening and unsettling murders in American history. Of all the true crime stories this channel has covered, many are infamous for their brutal and terrifying nature, but few have disturbed me as thoroughly and absolutely as the abduction and murder of April Tinsley. On Friday, April 1st of 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley arrived home from school and asked her mother if she could go over to play at a friend's house. Her mother agreed and gave April a bag of Easter candy to share once she'd arrived. We know that April arrived at this friend's house safely, but once she was there, the heavens opened up and a torrential downpour began to soak the Fort Wayne streets. Once the rain cleared up a little, the two friends suddenly wished to play outside, but knowing she'd been soaked through in no time if she did, April decided to walk over to a second friend's house to retrieve an umbrella she'd left there in the days prior. When April walked out of the door, she told her friend that she'd return soon, possibly even with this second friend so she could join in the fun with them. But April was never seen again. Once her loved ones realized that she was missing, they scoured the streets of their south-central Fort Wayne neighborhood, but April was nowhere to be found. They quickly alerted the local authorities, and this prompted both police and volunteers to conduct a massive, immediate search. To their horror, one witness reported seeing a Caucasian male in his mid-30s dragging a terrified April into a blue pickup truck, but this report proved fruitless as no such vehicle was located in the immediate aftermath. Both the police and April's parents took part in several widely publicized appeals for information, but no one else came forward with any pertinent particulars. Then, just 3 days later, April's parents received the worst news imaginable, the news that every parent prays they never hear. They were told their daughter had been murdered. April's cold, lifeless body was discovered at the bottom of a ditch along the rural DeKalb County road. April's cold, lifeless body was discovered at the bottom of a ditch along the rural DeKalb County road. She had been dead for around 48 to 60 hours, meaning she'd been murdered just hours after being kidnapped. Although she was discovered wearing all of the clothes she had disappeared in, the subsequent autopsy revealed that she had been violated before being suffocated, possibly with some kind of rag or piece of cloth. Yet even more disturbing was the fact that an adult marital aid was discovered not far from her body, one that was said to have April's DNA on it. The police managed to recover some of the supposed murderer's DNA from April's body, and coupled with the possible suspect description that they had already received, it seemed that it was just a matter of time before the killer was located and arrested. Yet somehow, even with all the evidence and manpower law enforcement had at their disposal, the case went cold, and no arrests were ever made. Just over 2 years later, in May of 1990, a teenage boy made a call to local police saying that he made a bone-chilling discovery near the intersection of St. Joe Center and Schwartz Roads. A message had been scrawled on a barn in either pencil or a dark-colored crayon, and when the police arrived, they saw that it read, "I kill April Tinsley. I will kill again." The discovery reignited the investigation into April's murder, albeit only for a brief time, and after another fruitless search for clues and leads, the search for her killer once again went cold. Then, in 2004, more than 14 years after the murder had occurred, a series of terrifying handwritten notes were discovered having been stuffed into mailboxes or stuck to the bicycles of innocent children. The notes contained grammatical errors and misspellings that were identical to what was found scrawled on the barn 12 years earlier, and investigators were united in their belief that the notes, as well as the graffiti on the barn, had indeed been the work of April's murderer. Of the 4 messages located both in Fort Wayne as well as in the surrounding area, 3 were left attached to bicycles that belonged to young girls and only had been stuffed into a mailbox. All were written on lined yellow notepaper and had been placed into transparent plastic bags. Some of these plastic bags included a Polaroid picture depicting the nude lower half of a man the police believed to be April's killer, and some even included a used contraceptive. DNA samples were taken from those, which were then compared to those taken from April's body 14 years earlier, and they were an uncontested match. One of the handwritten notes, which had been placed in the basket of a young girl's bicycle, read as follows: "Hi, honey. Been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and kill April Tinsley. You are my next victim. If you don't report this to police and I don't see this in the paper, I will blow up your house." As you can imagine, this caused a huge stir in the local media, and April's grief-stricken parents were forced to relive the pain and torment they had felt on the day her body was found. Disgusted and horrified, local law enforcement promised to do everything they could to find the man who was now taking pleasure in taunting the residents of Fort Wayne. But just like so many years before, they had absolutely no luck in bringing April's killer to justice. Thankfully, this incredibly sick and disturbed individual had remained silent ever since, and had never again attempted to remind the local populace of the horrifying acts he'd taken such pleasure in committing. In 2016, the police announced that, thanks to the advancements in DNA profiling technology, they had been able to construct a rough image of what their suspect looked like. He's said to be a white male with dark hair and brown or hazel eyes, and based on the witness descriptions from 1988, it's thought that he could be well into his 50s. That's what's particularly horrifying about this case. It's bad enough that April was killed in such a horrific manner, and that her killer took the time to anonymously but publicly gloat of what he'd done. It's the fact that whenever you see a middle-aged man in Fort Wayne who just so happens to have dark hair and dark eyes, you might just be looking at one of the sickest, most depraved murderers who's ever stepped foot on American streets. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Easters are not when they seem.